Today, we're going to talk about subjectivist audiophile advice that hurts new listeners. There are 10 plus a bonus. So let's get into it. There's a lot of advice in the audiophile world, some helpful, some harmless, and some that actively misleads new listeners. Today, I want to talk about the kind of subjectivist advice that sounds deep and passionate, but actually sets people down a very costly and frustrating path, assuming they ever figure it out. The first one is trust your ears, but don't ever do a proper A B test. The trust your ears advice is a little bit ironic from people who never blind or volume match any tests. Several years ago, I created a video explaining how anybody can create for themselves a $25 test bench to do proper A B tests for any equipment, whether it's IEMs or headphones or DACs or amplifiers. And you could do that still now using off the shelf components you can find on AliExpress or Amazon or almost anywhere else on the internet. As long as you use rigorous methodology that you note and you think about in advance and that which is repeatable, you can do your own A B tests at home and not rely upon audiophile jargon to try to justify what you think you might be hearing. Confirmation bias is something that we all have to acknowledge. There's confirmation bias from objectivists and subjectivists and from people like me who try to sit somewhere in the middle, even when I say that the true passion and understanding of audiophilia is really the melding of objectivism and subjectivism to sit somewhere in the middle ground. But that itself is a bias that I have to first acknowledge. And once acknowledged, I have to do something about it. I have to mitigate against the unknown bias or the known bias to try to prevent myself from leaning one direction or the other before the tests are even done or completed. My own experience with A/B testing revealed the following. When I first got into audiophilia, when I first became an audiophile, I really didn't know anything. So I went to forums, I watched YouTube videos, I tried to get some magazines. Of course, magazines are difficult to obtain these days. And I tried to kind of read up on it. And I thought that going through that pattern, I would learn more about audio and understand what it is I needed to know in order to grow in my audiophile journey. It took me a couple of years to realize that I was listening to a lot of people who didn't know any better than me when I first started out. And some of those individuals had nefarious intent. They had only the intent to sell me something. They wanted to believe anything that was put in front of them. They never really wanted to challenge the beliefs that they had been carrying forward because they had heard it somewhere before. And when I spent thousands upon thousands upon thousands of dollars on audiophile gear, and I started to kind of question what I was believing, and I started to do comparisons first without an A/B switch and then with an A/B switch before a testing methodology was created. I was doing everything I could to try to figure this stuff out, whether I was really hearing the things that these people are talking about. And I realized after I actually sat down and did my own test that I wasn't hearing those things, that those things did not exist. And it wasn't because of my hearing, which is another audiophile myth that we'll get to later. My journey from being a young audiophile to a seasoned audiophile, now with a different perspective on the community and the hobby, is that it's wonderful when you first start out because it's new and it's fresh and it's exciting and there's all sorts of stuff that you want to explore and get into. And you have to be cautious because the last thing you want to do is end up spending thousands of dollars like I did before you realize that you just wasted thousands of dollars that you can never get back. So the trust your ears um, advice is not advice. It doesn't help you at all. It just basically tells you to shut up, don't question, and simply follow along, toe the tagline like everybody else has. And if that sounds like you, like that's what you're comfortable with, then okay, that's okay for you. But You don't really get to do it for anybody else and tell them that they should also toe the tagline because you chose to toe the tagline. Expectation bias affects perception. Numerous psychoacoustic studies confirm that when listeners expect to hear a difference, they do often, even when none exists. This is a well-documented cognitive bias, and you don't have to take my word for it. You can research this online. You can go on Google and put in the search pattern for psychoacoustic studies for cognitive bias, and you can actually hone in on expectation bias effects, and you can find examples and studies would tell you the parameters under which individuals first form that bias and then continue to propagate that bias. Blind ABX testing regularly debunks "I heard this difference" sort of mentality. When volume matched and blind tested, most listeners cannot reliably distinguish between two transparent audio sources. For example, if you have an audio source, say one DAC versus another DAC, and the person who's listening doesn't know what those DACs are, does not know how they're configured, does not understand what the cabling is, and they're forced to choose between one or the other, they have no better than a 50% chance of guessing. And that's a 50% chance that anybody could possibly guess, meaning it's a flip of the coin. And frankly, that's not knowing the differences between the sound signature of one DAC or the other. Even if you're right 50% of the time, it just means that you were right 50% of the time, which is the law of probability. That is going to happen given sufficient time in doing the test, if that kind of makes sense. The next issue, the next audiophile myth from Subjectivist is that every DAC sounds different. And this is a huge one, as we know. Yes, DACs can sound different, but if they do, it's because of something measurable. DSP, frequency coloration, distortion, not because they cost $1,000 or $10,000 or $15,000. Money has nothing to do with it, except for, well, a company using really shoddy components. And those components, those shoddy components, could potentially add distortion or color the sound in some way that perhaps you find pleasant in some music, but others might find completely annoying and unacceptable. DACs use the same chipsets, the same boards, and sound identical when you do an actual A/B test, when you're not out to actually confirm your own bias, but instead to test your own bias. We know that tech companies use the same chipsets. We know that they bulk purchase these chipsets, especially companies that churn out DACs several times a year. There are companies like Shit Audio who create their own DACs, who program their own DACs. Chord does the same. And some people might argue that because these companies have generated, created, programmed, boarded their own DACs, that those DACs sound different, that those DACs actually are warmer or more clinical or more musical, whatever terminology you may want to impose on them. And my counter argument to that would be, prove it. It just seems to me that these companies, Shit or Chord or any such other company that says that they program their own DACs, they should provide actual measurements. They should allow the public to see what they mean. It shouldn't be a dangerous scenario for these companies. For example, if Shit Audio and Chord published their measurements, which showed that their DACs actually have a measured difference in an audible range with their DACs, then that would only promote their DACs and their products. People would only go out and purchase them because they would know at that point that these products do something different. And people want different. I want different. If tomorrow Shit Audio released measurements and provided data and said that this, our new DAC, does in fact color the sound, and here's how the frequency range is affected, here's how your music will be affected, here's how you can expect to experience the changes, I would put my money down and I would buy that product so I could listen to it and verify that. I think a lot of people would do that, and it just doesn't make any sense for these companies to hide the ball if it's actually happening. My hypothesis is that it's not happening because it doesn't make any sense in the business end. If you're a business owner and your job is to make money and not to give away gear for free, then you want to sell as much as you can. And that would be the way to sell as many DACs as Chord and Shit and other companies like that could possibly sell if they were transparent about it, if they were truthful about the actual efficacy of these claims. But they're not. They're not providing that information. The only logical conclusion is that it doesn't exist, and they would rather play upon typical audiophile myths, your assumptions and your biases in order to sell products, because they know that if they actually did in fact publish their internal measurements and they did in fact provide you with their internal data for their DACs, it will show exactly the same thing as with topping and SMSL. That they're neutral, they're flat, they're transparent, and any variations are way, way below the audible threshold. DACs, I would like you to understand, can and have been measured. I know a lot of people say that audio science review is not some place that they want to frequent because of the bias there, and that is true. Audio science review does have bias, just like any other place has a certain amount of bias, but they do provide measurement data that a lot of manufacturers refuse to provide. And at least that's one aspect, one factor you can take into consideration, just looking at their data profile, to determine whether a particular product that you're about to purchase is worth it in the long run. So there are resources out there for you to take advantage of, even if you actually disagree with the individuals associated with those resources. If you take those resources and you actually apply them in a meaningful manner, in an honest way, you could still come out ahead. The danger is, of course, that you misinterpret what they're saying, and so you will have to ask some questions and you will have to dig a little bit deeper from time to time. Now, how about the next myth from Subjectivist? You need to spend more money. Price does not equal performance, especially in audio. Some of the most expensive gear just adds flavor. That's what we're told. Well, that's not the case. The more expensive headphone doesn't mean it sounds more musical. It just sounds different. They've tuned it differently. And by the way, that more expensive headphone looks very different from the cheaper headphone, doesn't it? That $8,000 headphone isn't made of plastic. That $8,000 headphone has a very flashy appearance. That $8,000 headphone is in limited quality and quantity. That $8,000 headphone is the type that people covet because certain individuals online were given the opportunity to review them and they gushed about them. And oh my God, this $8,000 headphone can only be amazing in every way. The dynamics, the structure of the music, the texture of the music, and etc., etc., etc. Headphones are not mysterious. Whether you're using planar magnetic drivers or dynamic drivers, or using something like electrodynamics drivers, like stacks, it doesn't make any difference. This is an understood mechanic. It's not something that's secretive to each company. Dynamic headphones have been around for over 100 years. Dynamic headphones are not rocket science anymore. They never were to begin with. They were fantastic when they first came out, but they haven't really moved the ball along much. We've learned how to use transducers. We've used different componentry, but there's no exotic materials being used in any of these headphones, not the actual voicing, not the actual speaker units. The only exotic elements that companies and headphone manufacturers use is maybe on the external. Maybe they use carbon fiber. Maybe they wrap their cables in Kevlar for whatever strange reason. But more money does not mean better performance. And the same thing is true for DACs and amps and cables and anything else associated with audiophilia. A $500 DAC is not going to sound half as good as a $1,000 DAC. It doesn't work that way. Now, it could be that the $1,000 DAC has more features that the $500 DAC doesn't, and that might justify the price hike. That's certainly possible. It could be that the $1,000 DAC has the ability to add DSP at the click of a button, in which case, yeah, that DAC might be worth checking out. But in the long run, unless there are actual features that you can see and you know are going to make some sort of change to the experience overall, DACs in different price categories, amps in different price categories, are not different or better just because one is more expensive than the other. Objective measurements show diminishing returns well beyond entry-level transparent gear. A $99 DAC can outperform a $999 DAC in distortion and noise, which are really the things that we look for when we're talking about amplifiers and DACs and headphones. Expensive gear may offer luxury materials or aesthetics, as I mentioned, but this has no bearing on audio transparency or fidelity. Yeah, there are headphones out there that just sound really muddy and terrible, and they cost basically nothing. And yeah, those are really badly tuned, terrible headphones using terrible materials. That happens. But if you have a competent headphone built by somebody who actually wants to create a competent headphone, then it's not as if that headphone, even though it's $99, is going to sound worse than a $150 headphone. That $50 difference is not going to be a real difference there. That $10,000 difference is not going to be a difference there. There's going to be a difference in voicing. There's going to be a difference in how the manufacturer wants their headphones to sound. And that is the key linchpin here. When you buy headphones or IEMs, you're getting different sound signatures because the manufacturer designed those specific headphones to have a specific type of voicing. And when you hear that difference, it's not because the $10,000 headphone sounds better because it has more dynamics. It's because it has a different voicing. Of course, it sounds different. And that's the point. If you have two headphones and they are built by two different companies with two different distinctive styling and voicing, you're going to like one and not like the other, or you're going to like both, or you're going to hate both. Those are the only three options. That doesn't mean that the one that you like is better built or just has better acoustics or better dynamics. It might to a certain degree, but it doesn't have to be the case. And it certainly isn't the case for expensive headphones every single time. The next one is buy what sounds good to you without any tools to actually determine what that means. There's a dangerous combination of personal preference and zero testing. And again, this is going to be a returning theme here. When you don't do your own testing and you're just buying whatever sounds good to you, that flavoring, that choice is going to change over time, and then you're going to end up regretting something that you purchased for a lot of money. Telling a beginner to buy something because you liked it doesn't help. It just shifts your bias onto them. You see this all the time on YouTube, whether it's for audiophile gear or for cameras or anything else, really. I liked it. I endorse this particular product. You should buy it because I think it's fantastic. Who cares? Who cares what you think? Nobody really cares what I think. Nobody really cares what anybody else thinks. The only thing that matters is whether this particular product fits into your lifestyle. It does what you want it to do, and if you are willing to pay the price that they're charging. But there's the other side of it, which is just buy what sounds good to you. Well, that's true, but just because this thing sounds good to me does not mean it is a wise purchase. I could potentially get the same sound using cheaper components. And don't forget, if I haven't listened to other components, if I haven't researched other components, if I don't know what other components are or how this stuff works, then I might just be buying things based upon somebody's whimsical suggestion that I should. Without level matching, blind switching, or consistency, subjective claims are anecdotal at best and misleading at worst. And quite frankly, I believe it's the latter. They are misleading. They are purposefully misleading because a lot of times people refuse to do the legwork to confirm what they think they hear. And more importantly, to disabuse themselves of what they hear, to try to explain why what they're hearing may not be true. It is that intent to disprove what you are hearing that would make you less biased because you are trying to actively demonstrate that you are not going to just blindly accept whatever is coming your way. Instead of chasing gear for flavor, as I've said multiple times, use EQ or DSP. It's flexible, it's measurable, and it is instantly reversible. You may not want to use EQ or DSP. You may not enjoy the process, and that's okay. But at least that's one way to do it in such a manner that you don't actually have to be stuck with it. It doesn't cost you anything, And it really could produce exactly what you're asking for without going down this road and this path of audiophile jargon and nonsense. The next subjectivist claim, a big one, is cables make a big difference. This is one of the most persistent myths. There's a lack of evidence for audible differences between well made cables. Boutique cable marketing relies on vague terms like air, speed, black background, and exotic cryo syncing or all that certain nonsense. Look, the bottom line is as long as it's well shielded and properly terminated, it's doing its job. Save your money. A $20 monolith cable is going to be perfect, and you do not need to spend $500 on a headphone cable. There's nothing in that gap that makes that $500 cable better measured or audible. Electronic properties like resistance and capacitors and capacitance are too small in well-built cables to affect sound over short distances. Now, if you're talking about 15, 20 feet or longer, yeah, there might be some disturbances. There might be some effect of the environment on those cables, which would, in fact, potentially affect what you're hearing. But when was the last time you ran a headphone cable that was 15 feet? When was the last time you ran a DAC cable from your computer to your DAC that was 25 feet? If you have, you may just want to move your computer closer to your DAC. For digital signals, cables either work or they don't. And this is the other one. It's not just analog cables, for example, headphone cables, your headphone to your amplifier. This is also digital cables mythology. Audio via USB, SPDIF, or HDMI is binary, zeros and ones. If the data arrives intact, no further quality exists. There's no extra detail in a $300 USB cable versus a $15 USB cable. Again, shielding and terminator is the exact thing that we're looking for. As long as it's properly shielded, a $15 cable is going to work just as good as a $300 or $5,000 cable. Zeros and ones either exist or they do not. If there's something wrong in the transmission, that transmission error occurred at the source, very likely, which means your computer or your phone. There's something you can actually try yourself at home. And if you have Bluetooth, pair something with Bluetooth and then walk a certain distance. Walk 15, 20, 30 feet away from your source of the Bluetooth. And then you'll receive dropout, where the Bluetooth will fade in and out, or the music will jump, or you'll just completely not hear anything after a certain distance. This is the missing link here. There's no more data to be sent to the receiving end. And because there's no more zeros and ones coming at you, there's no audio there. There's no data there. You get back into the stream, you move closer, you remove obstacles, and all of a sudden you come right back in. It either exists or it doesn't exist. That is the bottom line, and no matter how often audiophiles, subjectivists tell you otherwise, it's simply not true. There is no scientific basis for their claims. I mean, think about it. NASA is not buying audiophile USB and HDMI cables for their multi-billion-dollar spacecraft. Why? Because they have actual engineers creating their gear. Then how about filters and NOS or OS modes create magic? Non-oversampling, NOS, and oversampling. Many DACs come with selectable DAC filters. Some subjectivists claim night and day changes among all these filters, but in reality, most filters have incredibly subtle audible effects, if at all. If you have to imagine the difference, it's probably not there. Most filters affect frequencies above 20 kilohertz, above 20,000 hertz, which is well beyond human hearing, especially for an adult. Any audible change is extremely subtle and not reliably detectable in blind tests. And on top of that, let us assume, as I mentioned last time in my last video, that a filter kicks in around 20 kilohertz or 19 kilohertz or 18 kilohertz. Your music doesn't exist there. Look at your music, what you listen to. If your frequency response graph shows, your spectral graph shows that there is no data in the 17, 18, 19, 20 kilohertz range, what is happening? Who cares if that filter is working or not? There's no information there to be affected by this filter. Once again, like I said last time, the vast majority of music that we listen to, vast majority of audio we listen to, is not in the 20 kilohertz region. In fact, it would be a surprise if it went beyond 11 or 12 kilohertz. Non-oversampling DACs introduce measurable artifacts from time to time. If you like that sound, that's fine, but it's more natural is not an excuse. Just because somebody says, oh, my NOS, my non-oversampling DAC sounds more natural, more musical, that's not the case. First of all, number one, those measurable artifacts, if they exist in NOS DACs, have to be in the audible range. If they're not in the audible range, it doesn't matter. That is a clear way to determine if a DAC is actually going to affect what you are listening. If it's below your hearing threshold, either by volume or by frequency range, then it doesn't matter. The next one, which became kind of important for some amount of time in the last several years, was R2R DACs are more natural and analog sounding. There's some nostalgia and mystique of R2R resistor ladder DACs, certainly, and I completely agree with that. I think that R2R DACs are nostalgic. I think that they are an interesting past. They're a history of modern DACs. But R2R doesn't mean better. They can actually measure worse and often can sound colored if their distortion, if their effect is in the audible range. And there is no guarantee that that will be the case. If you like that type of flavor, if it turns out that R2R DACs that you're using do have some sort of coloration, that they are in fact measuring differently, then the next question is that difference in the audible range? If that difference is found at negative 40 decibels, then you are not hearing it. And you have to crank your volume knob up significantly in order to hear any difference. But at that point, you're not listening to the music anymore because you've taken off your headphones or you've turned off your speakers because you can't handle that increase in volume. So whenever you see measurements in the wild online talking about R2R DACs measured differently, that may be the case, but that measurement probably is not in the audible range. R2R DACs may show higher THD, noise, and frequency irregularities, which could be pleasing, which is something I mentioned in the last couple of videos, that again, if you want to color your sound, you can add tubes to it, which adds total harmonic distortion, THD, which we tend to find somewhat pleasant in our music. And R2R DACs could potentially introduce that, but not because R2R DACs, just the idea of R2R DACs are somehow better than solid state modern DACs, but because R2R DACs will probably use faulty components or less shielded components or just components that were not properly soldered or any number of other explanations about why they're introducing this additional noise. They just weren't designed in the way that modern capability is. That could be a very easy explanation for why R2R DACs might measure differently. The natural or analog sound from R2R is just distortion flavoring. If that's your preference, if you can hear it, and if it is, in fact, most importantly, in the audible range, it's not technically superior. It's just different. Upgrading the power supply will transform your system. This is number 8. Linear power supplies are, frankly, oversold. In some systems, like noisy digital sources, it might reduce noise by some amount, but only if there's a measurable issue here. Now, I remember several years ago, I reviewed a Loxg P20, I believe it was, a tube hybrid amp. And I mentioned that after I purchased a third-party power supply, the amplifier tended to have a little bit more tubey sound signature with the provided tubes. And it turned out from my own testing and then research online is that the power supply that Loxg provided in the box was not wasn't providing sufficient power, let's just say, right? It was different voltage, or that wasn't providing sufficient current. It just wasn't working properly. And so when I purchased just a generic $20 power supply from a no-name brand and plugged it in, there seemed to be a marginal difference in performance that potentially could happen. I mean, it's the same way with your computer. If you have a computer that requires 800 watts power supply and instead you provided 600 watts power supply, yeah, there's going to be some give and take here. Components are not going to work at their best, and some components just may not power on at all, right? So if you're not providing the sufficient power supply to a particular component, it's not going to perform as it's supposed to be. And so there is some aspect to that. However, like I said, power supplies are oversold. Most modern gear is already well isolated internally. A cleaner looking power supply doesn't guarantee cleaner sound. So there's no point spending thousands of dollars, hundreds of dollars on a new power supply from an audiophile retailer. Properly designed equipment has power filtering, power regulation, and noise rejection built into them. Upgrading the PSU changes little to nothing in audible output. If you're not hearing hum, buzz, or dropouts, things that I mentioned last time in my last video, your power supply is doing its job. A better looking PSU doesn't mean better sounding PSU. Number 9, burn-in changes the sound. This is fairly controversial, like everything else that subjectivists say, but it's an evergreen myth, meaning it never, ever ends. Driver burn-in versus brain burn-in, which is really adaptation. There are companies that say that you need to burn in our headphones for 100 hours. Well, the problem is that by the time you're done burning in those headphones, your return period has ended, and you can't return those headphones anymore. Instead, what these people really are talking about, these companies, is adaptation period. You get used to the sound signature. I mean, I feel it all the time because I have the luxury of having a multitude of headphones. If I switch from an Austrian audio headphone to, let's say, an Audio-Technica headphone, it's going to take me a little bit of time to finally acclimate from one to the other. And that's because the two headphones have vastly, vastly different sound signatures and build and comfort and all sorts of other things. So when companies tell you you need to burn these headphones in for 100 hours, you just need to understand what they're actually telling you is give these headphones a little bit of time and then decide whether you like them or not. Unfortunately, subjectivists take this notion and take it a little bit too far. They claim that if you drive these headphones for 100 hours, if you power them, if you listen to them, if you just leave them plugged in and play white noise or pink noise for 100 hours or however much long they need, then it'll improve the sound. That's not the case. Resistors, capacitors, and chips do not audibly change over time. If they do, it's due to failure, not settling in. Studies show that listeners get used to sound profiles. This is brain burn-in, not hardware burn-in. And, speaking of hardware burn-in, I have to tell you, it really peeves me when I see subjectivists talking about burning in solid-state components. How exactly do you burn in solid-state components? They're solid-state. They don't burn in. They've been soldered into place. They are chips. They are capacitors, resistors, and all that sort of stuff. But unless it's a faulty component somewhere inside the board, you're not doing anything other than powering it and listening to it. There's no such thing as digital burn-in. In some circles, you'll also find people saying you need to burn in cables. Another completely ridiculous statement. There's no such thing as burning in cables. Number 10, you need expensive headphones to hear nuanced differences in DACs or amplifiers. This actually is a go-to argument for many subjectivists, even if they don't have the gear that they're promoting. Changing headphones is just that, listening to a different sound signature like I mentioned a little while ago. Let's say you listen to a particular DAC, and you say that these HD6XX headphones just aren't dynamic enough to help me hear the nuances of this very expensive DAC, this R2R DAC. But I buy, which is a subjectivist holy grail headphone apparently, the Susvara. And I spend thousands of dollars getting the Susvara, and all of a sudden, the nuances of the DAC are finally apparent. The problem with that sort of statement is the following. You switch from one headphone to another headphone, and you're listening to a different sound signature from a different headphone. You're not listening to the DAC, you're listening to the headphone. It's the same thing with IEMs or speakers. When you change the listening parameters, you change the listening parameters. You don't actually hear the differences of the actual test that you're supposed to be performing. So this is why ABX tests are important. You use the same methodology, you use the same type of gear to test the gear that's new. You don't change everything and then say, now I hear a difference, because the methodology has changed. So the next time somebody tells you you need one of these expensive headphones or IEMs to hear the differences in this DAC or amp, it's not true. All you're listening to is a different sound signature from that headphone or IEM. It could be that a particular headphone is more revealing, has more detail, and therefore the music that you're listening to sounds more detailed, sounds clearer. It appears to you that there's wider soundstage from one given headphone versus another, but that's not due to the DAC or amplifier. That's due to the headphone sound signature and design. Know the difference. And now we get into the bonus. This section is regarding a video that is 1 year old. It's about GoldenSound's video on DACs can make a difference, which is in fact a clickbait title that doesn't come close to proving what GoldenSound actually said. Now, the reason I bring this up is because somebody on my channel the last several days has been talking about listening properly to DACs and being able to differentiate a DAC sound signature. And they mentioned GoldenSound, and okay, well, let's briefly talk about GoldenSound. Now, first and foremost, I do want to state that GoldenSound has almost 200,000 followers, and I have 15,000. And therefore, that number alone should indicate to you that he is a much more reliable source if numbers is what you go by. And by the way, I would like to point out that GoldenSound was paramount in explaining to the community that MQA is bogus, a factoid that we had already known for a very long time before GoldenSound made his video. But I do have to say, his video was compelling and it was accurate, just like all that information had been present before he came on the scene. Okay, so let's talk about GoldenSound's recent video 11 months ago called The Proof That DACs Can Make a Difference! Exclamation mark, by the way. It got a lot of traction, but I think it's important to clarify what was actually proven in this test that he did, and most importantly, what wasn't proven. And despite that dramatic title, GoldenSound's entire conclusion is based on a very narrow, very specific condition: his ability to hear audio differences caused by oversampling filters at frequencies around and above 20 kilohertz. That's it. It's not about DACs in general. It's not about regular music playback. It's not real-world listening scenarios, just one very specific technical case. He said that he could reliably ABX two versions of a song 18 out of 20 times, and it seems like he did. But here's the key. The only audible difference was in the high-frequency content near 20 kilohertz, a range that most people cannot hear. And once again, the range at which vast majority of music is not recorded. There is no information there. GoldenSound later admits in the video he can personally hear above 20 kilohertz, which is, kind of rare, especially for a 26-year-old. And now that he's probably around 27 or so, I'm sure that hearing is degrading to a certain extent. But let us assume that he can hear at 20 kilohertz or higher. That itself is not proof that DACs are audibly changing anything. And of course, the fact that he was listening to filters and not DACs is important. Regardless, what does that prove? That he personally can detect slight differences in high-frequency roll-off due to reconstruction filters. That's interesting, I'm sure, but it's not a revelation. It's not something new. It's not something that's just been discovered by GoldenSound. Once again, he's late to the party and just repeating what has been known for a long time. And it's not generalizable to the vast majority of listeners. I mean, let us assume that he is correct, that he's telling the truth. He can actually hear 20 kilohertz and higher, maybe slightly higher, 21 kilohertz, let's say. The vast majority of people cannot. And once again, vast majority of music is not recorded in that range anyway. The next thing he said is that this test proves well-measuring DACs aren't audibly transparent. I don't know where he's getting that idea from. No, it doesn't prove that. It proves that if you have near superhuman hearing, granted, maybe he does, and you can isolate a test to just one element, say an oversampling filter with known high frequency variation, you can maybe hear a difference if you have music or audio that's playing in that 20 kilohertz region. That's not the same as saying two transparent DACs sound different during normal use. That's not how it works. Now, GoldenSound didn't actually test two real DACs. He tested two digital files upsampled differently. So he obviously created this and then he used it. And his test didn't involve dynamic range or distortion or, let's say, even jitter or any other of the things that usually are discussed in DAC transparency. It focused on filter-induced FR variation, frequency response variation, right at the edge of audibility. And of course, once again, he created the audio and he created the testing parameters for him. An individual who is apparently capable of hearing 20 kilohertz and slightly higher. This also challenges the notion of transparency, is what basically he's trying to say, that there's no such thing as transparency in DACs. But let's be clear, transparency means a device does not audibly alter the signal under normal listening conditions. And we can debate about what normal listening conditions is, of course, but let's also just be clear that normal listening conditions is probably not what he was doing. That threshold is well understood and backed by research, right? GoldenSound's result doesn't challenge the normal condition, which is basically you listening to music in your daily life. He even admits the difference is subtle if it's audible at all, and that most people probably will not hear it or even care about it. If anything, his video reinforces the idea that for 99.999% of people, modern DACs are in fact audibly transparent. His own tests only worked because he could hear past 20 kilohertz in music that actually produced, or sounds that actually were produced at 20 kilohertz or higher, something most people cannot do and most music does not employ. Now, there's the other claim, justification, that at least some subjectivists have been promoting, is that this video that he created, this test that he created, was a real-world test. No, it wasn't. He ran a digital ABX using files processed with different filters in HQ Player. That doesn't simulate how real DAC hardware behaves across a variety of tracks, outputs, or playback systems. It's a control software test of filter behavior, not a practical comparison of modern DACs in the wild. And even then, his conclusion was only possible because of his unusual hearing profile. And I don't mean unusual in a derogatory term. It's just different. It's something that the vast majority of people do not have. Okay, so at the end of the day, GoldenSound did not prove that DACs sound different. In fact, he did not come remotely close to it. When he doesn't even actually listen to two DACs, that's a problem. Now, he did prove the following, that you use extreme filter differences, you can hear extreme differences. That you can conduct a test that isolates just that one element, which he did, and having hearing that exceeds 20 kilohertz can be helpful in hearing a very specific test parameter that you invent in order to prove your own hypothesis that you can hear over 20 kilohertz and that you have provided a testing parameter that is specific to proving that you can hear over 20 kilohertz, something like to that extent. This doesn't apply to normal listening, right? Normal DACs, normal ears, does not apply. So when people use this video to say, see, DACs all sound different, they're misrepresenting what was actually tested. And I can't blame them because GoldenSound's own title is complete clickbait. DACs might sound different when they're intentionally colored, poorly designed, or using extreme filters. But now, in 2025, most of them measure transparently. And in proper blind level matched ABX testing in real-world scenarios, they sound the same. And that's still the truth, no matter how elaborate the workaround is to find an exception, such as with GoldenSound's video. I'm not against testing. I'm completely for testing. I'm against stretching narrow edge cases results into sweeping conclusions that mislead new listeners. Because in this hobby, critical thinking matters more than ever. And unfortunately, there are far, far too many avenues by which people are misled and people are told to not use critical thinking. I'm not here to harp on subjectivists because, to an extent, I am personally a subjectivist. Like I said at the beginning, I like to meld the two, the objectivism and subjectivism, and sit somewhere in the middle. But we can't be run by subjectivists or objectivists alone. Our gear, how we perceive it, is important. The bias that I bring into a music session is my bias I have to acknowledge and either be happy with or do something to modify. But I think it is a stretch, a deep and unfortunate, unfounded, misleading stretch for subjectivists to constantly tell people that they need to spend money to get better sound quality. They need to spend money on better, more expensive components in order to really experience the music. That's not audiophilia. That is not what a new listener or any seasoned listener should be thinking of. Instead, every listener, whether you're new or you've been doing this for 50 years, your only goal should be to find the perfect component for you in your listening environment. And if you personally believe that all DACs sound different, okay, you are well entitled to believe that. But you're not entitled to tell everybody else that they should believe it, particularly since for decades upon decades upon decades, subjectivists have had the opportunity to prove it, and they've not, except in a very specific, extreme, purposefully engineered test study by one individual who has 200,000 followers and I have 15,000, let us be clear, by that individual who himself acknowledged it's an extreme case. And also, his video was clickbait.